Welcome to Top 10 Secret, the ultimate place for the most chilling mysteries. Do you dare to face the most haunting ghost stories? Shadows lurking in the dark, curses that can never be broken, mysterious events that send shivers down your spine, all waiting for you to uncover. Story 1. Have you ever had a recurring nightmare? What if that dream slowly started to become reality? Today, we'll uncover a chilling story about a mysterious room inside a towering building. Don't forget to like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any thrilling stories. The bizarre nightmares always come at midnight, when darkness engulfs everything and the silence becomes more terrifying than ever. A young man, though skeptical of omens and the supernatural, couldn't deny the chilling truth. Every night, he sank into the same dream. A strange yet horrifying dream, vivid enough to drench him in cold sweat when he woke. It wasn't just a fleeting nightmare, but a relentless loop, growing clearer each time, like a disturbing film rewound over and over in his subconscious. In the dream, he always found himself standing before a massive iron-wrought gate of an old, eerie mansion. The sky hung heavy with gray clouds, and the bare, gnarled branches of the trees stretched out like skeletal hands trembling in the cold wind. The rusted gate creaked with a sinister groan as he pushed it open. Inside lay a desolate garden, overgrown with wild grass, littered with moss-covered statues whose distorted faces seemed to follow his every move. He stepped into the mansion, an expansive yet chilling void. The walls were lined with aged portraits, their painted eyes tracking his movements with an unsettling intensity. The air was thick and oppressive, making his breath grow shallow. And then, she appeared. Mrs. Stone, a frail, elderly woman with ghostly pale skin, sunken cheeks, and deep, hollow eyes as dark as an abyss. She never spoke at first, merely standing there, watching him with an eerie smile stretched across her lips, a smile cold enough to freeze the blood in his veins. Then, in a voice as brittle and hollow as the wind howling through a graveyard, she whispered, "The room in the tower. It belongs to you." Each time, he jolted awake, heart pounding, body trembling. But what terrified him the most wasn't the dream itself. It was the way it changed. At first, everything was hazy, but with each passing night, the details sharpened. Every sound, every shadow in the house, even the chilling breath of Mrs. Stone. He could feel them more vividly than before. It was as if it wasn't just a dream. But that wasn't the worst part. In the beginning, Mrs. Stone simply stood there, whispering her cryptic words before vanishing. But as time passed, she began moving closer. Her gaze grew more piercing, and her bony hand would occasionally twitch as if trying to reach for him. And then, one night, she didn't just stand still. She took a step forward, slow, deliberate. Her cold, skeletal fingers nearly touched his skin. He woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. But this time, something was different. A faint red mark lingered on his neck, as if someone had actually touched him. The icy sensation still clung to his skin, a sinister reminder that what he had experienced might not be just a nightmare. The dreams escalated. They felt too real, too vivid. He started dreading sleep because every time he closed his eyes, Mrs. Stone was waiting, watching. Some nights he awoke with the unsettling feeling of being observed. His heart pounded wildly as he scanned the darkness, convinced that something was lurking in the shadows. But when he flicked on the lights, the room remained empty. Each morning, exhaustion weighed heavier on him. His once vibrant face turned pale, his eyes sunken from the lack of rest. People around him noticed his decline, his paranoia, the way he constantly glanced over his shoulder, the unease in his every movement. Yet, what frightened him the most was how the dream evolved. At first, He only stood outside the mansion. Then, he began stepping inside, walking through its dimly lit hallways, touching the worn-out furniture, feeling the cold wooden floors beneath his feet. It all felt real, and the room in the tower, it was always open, as if waiting for him. Inside, a four-poster bed with tattered crimson curtains stood at the center. A heavy wooden wardrobe loomed in the corner, and on the wall, an old, dust-covered painting. But none of those terrified him as much as the coffin in the middle of the room. Every time he saw it, an unexplainable dread gripped his soul. His breath hitched, his body locked in place. He could feel the ominous energy radiating from it, a silent invitation, or perhaps a warning. And then one night, the coffin opened. A pale, skeletal hand emerged from the darkness inside. Reaching, trembling. He screamed, struggling to tear himself away from the nightmare. But this time, when he woke up, he wasn't in his bed. He was standing outside a mansion, the same mansion from his dreams. His heartbeat roared in his ears. Was this real? Or was he still trapped in the nightmare? Had the dream finally bled into reality? And most importantly, if he stepped inside that door, would he ever come back? The darkness lurking in reality. After countless nights battling grotesque nightmares, he tried to convince himself that it was all just his mind playing tricks on him. But reality had a cruel way of shattering that illusion. When Clinton, a longtime friend, invited him over for dinner, he had no idea that this simple invitation would plunge him into utter terror. From the moment he set foot in the house, a shiver ran down his spine. He had seen this place before, in his dreams. The moss-covered walls, the towering windows, the dim lights flickering in the dark. Everything matched his nightmares with eerie precision. He blinked rapidly, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling himself it was just a coincidence. But when Clinton casually pushed open the iron gate, the creaking sound it made was identical to the one from his dreams. His steps grew heavier as he entered the house. The air inside carried an unnatural chill, not just the cold of the night, but something deeper, something invisible that seeped into his very bones. Candles lined the hallway, their flames dancing and casting distorted shadows on the walls. Even his own shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally, twisting in a way that made no sense. Clinton led him into the living room, where the dim glow of a vintage chandelier bathed the dark leather chairs in flickering light. A middle-aged woman with a kind expression approached, introducing herself as Clinton's mother. But the moment their eyes met, his heart clenched. This woman was not Mrs. Stone, yet something about her felt disturbingly familiar. Her eyes, they held the same haunting darkness as Mrs. Stone's in his dreams. He forced himself to remain calm, blending into the dinner conversation. Laughter and chatter filled the room, yet something was off. The sounds around him felt distant, as if the space he occupied wasn't entirely real, as if he were trapped between reality and illusion. "Stay the night," Clinton suggested casually. In that instant, his entire body froze. In his dreams, he was always forced to stay the night. And by morning, he was never the same again. But refusing wasn't an option. He hesitantly nodded, feeling an invisible grip tightening around his heart. That night, Clinton guided him up a spiraling staircase, each step creaking under their weight. He barely dared to breathe, his breaths blending into the thick, suffocating air. When they stopped before a heavy wooden door, Clinton pushed it open and smiled. The tower room has always been empty. The word struck him like a blade. He turned to look inside. A dusty room, a bed draped in crimson velvet, an old wooden wardrobe, and a large painting hanging on the wall. His blood turned to ice. It was her, Mrs. Stone. Though the painting was aged, her eyes remained piercing, almost alive, staring straight into his soul. Her frail hand rested lightly on a chair, but the most horrifying detail was the fresh red stain on her fingertip. Blood. He spun around, ready to leave, but Clinton was gone. The door clicked shut behind him. He was trapped. A suffocating weight filled the air, pressing down on him. His throat dried as cold sweat dripped down his back. Slowly, he turned to face the painting once more. Mrs. Stone was no longer in it. His breath hitched. The darkness in the room thickened, wrapping around him. A frigid gust of wind rustled the velvet curtains, revealing something behind them. A coffin. It stood in the center of the room. His heart pounded against his ribs. In his dreams, he had never dared to see what lay inside. But now, it was right in front of him. And the worst part, the lid wasn't fully closed. A faint sound echoed through the air. Creak. The coffin's lid shifted. He stumbled back, but his feet refused to move. A pale hand emerged from the darkness inside, fingers twitching, reaching. Then a face surfaced from within the shadows of the coffin. Mrs. Stone. She wasn't dead. Or perhaps she had never truly left. Her hollow eyes snapped open, pitch black with no whites in sight. A slow, eerie smile crept across her ghostly face as she sat up. "This room has always been yours." The whisper slithered into his ears, freezing his blood. He screamed. He lunged for the door, pounding on it with all his might. But it wouldn't budge. Darkness surged forward, swallowing him whole. And then, everything faded into nothingness. The curse. In the darkness, night fell, draping the tower in an eerie, mysterious shroud. The room where he had been arranged to sleep was identical to the one in his dreams. Everything, the crimson-draped bed, the cold, lifeless walls, and the portrait of Mrs. Stone, was here, terrifyingly real. His breath grew shallow. The air in the room felt thick, an invisible weight pressing against his chest, making it hard to breathe. But what unsettled him the most was the coffin in the center of the room. It lay there, silent, as if waiting for something. In his dreams, he had never seen what was inside. But now, if this was truly reality, he knew he could no longer avoid it. He took a step back, pressing his hand against the wall behind him in search of something solid. The wallpaper was ice cold beneath his fingertips, but the moment he touched it, a sickening sensation rippled through his body. The surface beneath his hand. It wasn't a wall, it was breathing. He yanked his hand away, his heart hammering against his ribs. The room around him was no longer just an old, abandoned chamber. It was alive. A sudden creak shattered the silence. The coffin's lid shifted. A rush of freezing air seeped out, curling through the room like a whisper of death. He didn't dare move. His entire body was paralyzed. His eyes remained locked on the coffin as a pale, skeletal hand slowly emerged. The skin was wrinkled, deathly cold, and the long, jagged nails scraped against the wood, sending a shiver down his spine. A faint, raspy moan echoed from within, like a soul awakening from a centuries-old slumber. And then, she appeared. Mrs. Stone. Slowly, she sat up, her ghostly pale face emerging from the shadows. Her hollow eyes locked onto him, her thin lips stretching into a sinister smile. "At last, you've come." He stumbled backward, his heel catching the edge of the bed. A strangled gasp escaped his throat as she crawled out of the coffin, her bony fingers digging into the wooden edges. Her tangled hair cascaded over her face, strands clinging to her sunken cheeks like a decaying web. His pulse pounded like a war drum. No, this couldn't be real. But every movement she made, every deliberate, haunting shift, proved that he was no longer dreaming. He spun around, lunging for the door, twisting the handle with all his strength. It wouldn't budge. Behind him, the sound of shuffling footsteps crept closer. "Don't run." Her voice slithered into his ears, raspy and cold, like something crawling from the depths of the grave. A breath of icy air brushed the nape of his neck. He screamed. His fists pounded against the door, desperate. But then, a hand, frozen as death, clamped around his wrist. Nails like razor blades sank into his skin. A searing pain shot through his arm as she yanked him backward. The lights flickered. And then, darkness swallowed everything. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the room. He was lying on an ancient, tattered rug in a hallway that stretched endlessly into the void. The walls surrounding him were cracked, black liquid oozing from the fissures like bleeding wounds. Dizzy, he staggered to his feet, struggling to grasp his surroundings. But no matter where he turned, everything was veiled in shadow. Then, a quiet, chilling laugh echoed from the distance. He snapped his head around. A figure stood at the end of the hallway. Mrs. Stone. She didn't move, but somehow he felt her drawing closer. Not by walking, something far more terrifying. The corridor began to close in. The walls groaned, pressing inward, trapping him. His breath came in short, panicked bursts, cold sweat slicking his skin. He had to escape. He ran, through the suffocating darkness, through the sheer horror pulsing in his veins. But no matter how far he ran, the hallway never ended. And then, a door appeared. Without thinking, he lunged forward, slamming his hands against it. It burst open, flooding the space with blinding light. He fell through. When he opened his eyes again, he was in his own bed. Sunlight filtered through the window. Morning had come. But something was wrong. The air was still heavy, the damp, musty scent of the tower room lingering as if it had never left. Slowly, he turned his head to the side, and his heart stopped. There, beside his bed, where there should have been nothing but empty space, Mrs. Stone was sitting, the smile still etched upon her pallid face. "Did you really think you could leave?" The phantom in the midnight dark. The darkness in the room was no longer just an empty void. It was alive, slithering, crawling, like invisible tendrils creeping into every corner. He stood frozen, his breath growing shallow, his body stiff as his gaze locked onto the figure sitting beside the bed. Mrs. Stone, she wasn't dead. She had never left. Her frail hands rested on her lap, long, jagged nails lightly scraping against the fabric of her black dress. Her hollow, pupilless eyes drilled into him, as if attempting to pierce through his mind. Slowly, her cracked lips curled into a twisted smile. "You thought you had escaped?" Her voice was a rasping whisper, echoing from the depths of the earth, laced with the shattered cries of tormented souls. He bolted toward the door. But the moment his fingers grasped the handle, an icy sensation surged through his body. The door vanished. No way out. He turned back. The room was no longer the same. The walls, once pale, were now shifting, turning a deep, ominous crimson, as though someone had painted them with blood. Strange, eerie symbols spread across the surface, pulsating like living veins. The space around him constricted, the walls closing in as if trying to swallow him whole. Thud. A sound echoed behind him. Something was crawling. He didn't dare turn around, but it was getting closer. Thud. Mrs. Stone's shadow had disappeared. His jaw clenched, his entire body trembling. Every nerve in his being stretched to the breaking point. The air thickened, a putrid stench creeping into his nostrils. He held his breath, the unmistakable sensation of unseen eyes watching him from the darkness. And then, a cold hand touched his shoulder. He screamed, thrashing wildly, but his body wouldn't move. His legs refused to obey. A voice whispered against his ear, its breath like ice against his skin. It's time. His chest tightened. A searing pain radiated from his heart, as if an invisible hand was squeezing it in a merciless grip. His body collapsed, his vision fading. A suffocating darkness engulfed him. But before everything disappeared completely, he saw one last image. The coffin. It was open, and this time, it was meant for him. He jolted awake, his breath ragged, his body drenched in sweat. His eyes darted around. His room looked the same. Untouched. A dream. But was it really? His trembling hands reached for the blanket, and then he froze. On his wrist, 4 deep scratches carved into his skin, thin trails of blood seeping from the wounds. He looked down at the bed. A chill spread through his veins. Beneath the covers, the once pristine white sheets had changed color. Red. Blood. He lurched to his feet, rushing toward the door, no longer caring about anything else. But the moment he pulled it open, his body went rigid. The hallway beyond was pitch black. No light, no sound. Only one thing stood in the void. A coffin, standing upright in the middle of the hallway. Its lid was open, empty. And as the realization struck, a bony hand emerged from the darkness, clutching his throat. The next morning, when Clinton woke up, his friend was nowhere to be found. The bed was empty. There was no sign that he had ever been there. Except for one thing. The portrait hanging on the wall, the painting of Mrs. Stone, now had one more figure in it. And the eyes of the new figure were wide open, desperate, begging for help. The curse is not over. The quiet morning blanketed the house, but the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. Clinton stepped out of his room, his eyes burning from lack of sleep. A strange unease clung to him like a shadow, an invisible weight pressing down on his chest. He stopped in front of his friend's bedroom door. It was slightly ajar. "You up yet?" he called out, but no response came. A cold draft seeped through the crack. Something wasn't right. Slowly, he pushed the door open. The room was dark. The curtains were still drawn, trapping the space in a suffocating silence. No movement, no signs of life. But the first thing Clinton noticed was the bed. Empty. He swallowed hard and stepped closer. The mattress still bore the faint impression of someone who had just been lying there. But that wasn't what made his skin crawl. It was the blood. Dark stains seeped into the fabric, scattered like ominous shadows. A handprint was etched into the white sheets, a bony hand with unnaturally long fingers. Clinton took a step back, his heart hammering. This can't be happening. Where is he? His eyes darted around, searching for any rational explanation. But the room remained deathly silent, except for one thing. The painting. The portrait of Mrs. Stone hanging on the wall. But it wasn't the same as yesterday. Yesterday, she had been alone. Today, there was someone else in the painting. His friend. His face was frozen in terror, eyes wide open, mouth agape as if screaming, but no sound could escape. Both hands stretched forward, desperately reaching for something. Or someone. A shiver ran down Clinton's spine. His breath hitched. The painting was watching him. Suddenly, the air shifted. A powerful gust swept through the room, sending the curtains flaring wildly. Shadows slithered from beneath the bed, spreading across the floor like living tendrils. He felt it. Something was in the room. A cursed soul. And then, a voice whispered from the painting. "It's your turn." Clinton froze. The portrait began to change. Mrs. Stone's head slowly turned, her hollow eyes locking onto his. A twisted grin stretched across her withered face. "You think you can escape?" The room trembled. Darkness poured from the painting, swallowing everything like a monstrous entity waking from its slumber. Clinton spun around and bolted for the door. but it slammed shut. He pounded on it, fingers fumbling with the handle. No use. Behind him, footsteps echoed, dragging, scraping against the wooden floor. He turned and nearly screamed. A frail figure stood there. Not Mrs. Stone, his friend, but not human anymore. His skin was sickly pale, his eyes hollow, devoid of a soul. Bloodstains marred his nightclothes, and his skeletal hands twitched, clawing at the air. A voice, warped and lifeless, slipped from his lips. "Help me, Clinton." A chill clawed its way down Clinton's spine. That wasn't him. It was just a puppet, Mrs. Stone's puppet. The figure lunged. Clinton cried out, dodging to the side, crashing onto the floor. Darkness surged around him, spectral hands grasping at his limbs, dragging him down into a nightmare with no escape. He thrashed, reaching for anything, any way out. And then, a door burst open. Light flooded the room. Everything disappeared. Clinton awoke in an unfamiliar room. Daylight filtered through the window. His breaths were ragged, his body trembling. Where was he? A nurse approached. "You're awake. We found you unconscious near the forest, close to the old tower. Do you remember what happened?" Clinton opened his mouth, but his throat was dry. Memories flickered in his mind like shattered glass. His friend, the room, the painting. His friend. He bolted upright. "What about the person who was with me? Where is he?" The nurse frowned. "You were alone. We didn't find anyone else." A cold dread spread through him. No, that couldn't be true. His hands shook as he pulled back the blanket and froze. Deep scratches marred his wrist. This was real. But then something even worse caught his eye. On the stark white wall across from his bed hung a painting. Mrs. Stone was smiling, and standing beside her was one more person. The curse is not over. Never escape. Clinton sat on the hospital bed, his lifeless eyes fixed on the painting hanging on the wall. The portrait of Mrs. Stone was still there, but what terrified him the most was the figure standing beside her. It was his friend. His face was pale, his hollow eyes staring straight at Clinton, as if trying to say something, begging, pleading for help. Clinton's throat tightened. He wanted to believe this was some cruel prank, that someone was messing with him. But the scratches on his arm, the bloodstains on the bed, and the horrifying memories, they were all real. He took a deep breath, clenching his fists, trying to calm himself. But the longer he looked at the painting, the deeper the panic sank into his chest. If his friend was trapped inside, would he be next? Clinton was discharged the next day. No one believed his story. They said he was in shock, that fear had made him hallucinate. But he knew the truth. He had seen it. He had lived through it. And he knew it wasn't over. When he got home, Clinton locked every door, pulled the curtains shut. The apartment was pitch dark, but he didn't turn on the lights. He just wanted to hide, to forget everything that had happened. But it was all still there. He turned on his computer, searching for any information about Mrs. Stone. There were barely any official records, but obscure forums whispered strange tales. Those who had visited that house either vanished or returned, but never as themselves again. A shiver ran through Clinton. He refused to become one of them. He had to find a way to break the curse. That night, as he sat on his bed, his phone suddenly vibrated. A message from an unknown number. "Did you really think you escaped?" His body went cold. He jumped to his feet, checking the windows, the doors. Everything was locked. No one could have gotten in. Another message appeared. "Look behind you." Clinton froze. His mouth went dry. His trembling hands slowly turned him around, and he saw it. The painting. It was in his room. And this time, there weren't just two people in it. There were three. The third face was his own. A knock echoed through the room. Knock, knock, knock. Clinton didn't move. Knock, knock, knock. The knocking grew louder. He swallowed hard, inching toward the door, his chest tightening with dread. Knock, knock, knock. He held his breath, staring at the wooden door. A deep voice drifted from the other side. Clinton, open the door. His heart nearly stopped. It was his friend's voice. Impossible. He was trapped in the painting. He was gone. Then, what was standing outside? Clinton took a step back, trying not to make a sound. But at that moment, the door creaked open on its own. A gust of icy air rushed in, and in the hallway, no one was there. Only a large mirror hanging on the wall. Clinton stepped closer, staring at his reflection. And then, he realized something horrifying. His reflection wasn't there. Instead, Mrs. Stone's shadow loomed behind him. A skeletal hand, fingers unnaturally long, rested on his shoulder. He screamed. Darkness swallowed everything. The next day, the landlord called the police after noticing a strange odor coming from Clinton's apartment. When they broke down the door, the room was empty. No signs of struggle. No evidence that anyone had ever lived there. Only one thing remained. A painting hanging on the wall. The portrait of Mrs. Stone. And inside it, there was one more figure. Clinton's face, twisted in terror, his eyes wide with horror, his mouth frozen in a silent scream that would never be heard. As the officers were about to leave, one of them hesitated. Something didn't feel right. He turned back, looking at the painting one last time, and he swore. The eyes in the painting had just blinked. The curse will never end. Story 2. A Strange Wedding. Under the dim glow of an autumn evening, I recall the first time I met her, the girl who changed my life forever. That day, the high school courtyard buzzed with laughter and chatter, but the moment I saw her, everything seemed to freeze. Her eyes sparkled like distant stars, reflecting the entire sky within their depths. There was something about her, an invisible force that pulled me in, entwining my heart with hers from that very moment. She smiled, a gentle smile carrying the breath of heaven. Her voice, clear and soothing, was like an angel's song echoing through the world. I was certain she was my destiny. In the days that followed, I found myself searching for her in the crowd, longing to hear that voice again, to once more lose myself in those deep, mysterious eyes. We grew closer and soon became a couple. Our high school years passed in a blur of long walks through quiet streets, secret hand-holding in the library, and late-night conversations about the future. I loved her more with each passing day, and I believed she loved me just as much. After graduating from college, I didn't hesitate to propose. A simple ring, yet in her eyes, I saw an entire universe of happiness. We planned our future, a small house, a peaceful life, children running through the garden. Everything was perfect, but I never expected that peace to be the calm before the storm. Slowly, I began to notice changes in her. At first, it was just small things. She startled easily, her gaze sometimes distant as if drawn into a world beyond my reach. Then, the strange occurrences began. On the first few nights, I woke up to an eerie chill blanketing the room. Turning over, I saw her sitting up in bed, her back facing me. Her long hair obscured her face, but I could hear her murmuring. Disjointed, meaningless whispers, like an ancient incantation. I touched her shoulder. She jolted violently and turned to look at me with an unfamiliar expression. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She stared at me for a long moment before nodding slightly. But something was off. That feeling clawed at my mind, creeping deeper into my bones each night. In the following weeks, things only got worse. I started hearing strange noises in the room, faint whispers in the dark, soft footsteps even though both of us were in bed. I told myself it was all in my head, that it was just stress. But then, one night I woke up, and she was gone. Heart pounding, I switched on the light and saw her standing in the middle of the room, her back still turned to me. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice hoarse. She didn't answer. I took a step closer, reaching out, and the moment my fingers touched her shoulder, she spun around. The face staring back at me wasn't hers. My mouth went dry, a shiver ran down my spine. Her eyes, no, the thing before me, were pitch black, hollow, void of life. Her lips curled into a twisted smile, and a voice, not hers, emerged from her throat. "It doesn't belong to you anymore." I stumbled backward, my pulse hammering. In that moment, I knew. My wife, the woman I loved, was no longer the same, but I couldn't lose her. I lunged forward, pulling her into my arms, feeling her trembling body against mine. I had to bring her back. I had to do something before it was too late. And that was when I made my decision. A wedding. A ceremony unlike any other. A ritual to reclaim the woman I loved from the darkness that had taken hold of her. And I wouldn't let anything stand in my way. A proposal in the dark. I never once doubted my love for her. It wasn't a fleeting infatuation, but an invisible thread that bound me to her from the moment we met. Over the years, she became an inseparable part of my life. My breath, my heartbeat, my every thought revolved around her. And when we graduated from college, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I wanted her to be mine forever. The proposal wasn't extravagant, but I had poured my entire heart into it. A simple ring, a quiet evening under the soft glow of the streetlights, just the two of us. When I knelt down, her eyes widened, reflecting the golden light in a mesmerizing way. 1 second, 2 seconds. My heartbeat tightened. She didn't answer right away. For a fleeting moment, an unreadable emotion crossed her face. Was it hesitation? Fear? I wasn't sure. But then her lips trembled slightly, and finally, she nodded. A wave of emotion crashed over me, overwhelming, unstoppable. I pulled her into my arms, holding her fragile body tightly against mine. We planned our future together. A small house in a quiet suburb, mornings filled with laughter, long nights whispering to each other. I believed everything would be perfect, but I was wrong. So very wrong. The change. Not long after our engagement, I began to notice something strange about her. At first, it was subtle. She grew quieter, her eyes sometimes vacant, as if staring into an unseen abyss. But then, it became more apparent. She no longer laughed as much. Our conversations grew shorter, filled with unsettling silences. Some nights, I would wake up from restless dreams, only to find her missing from bed. My heart pounded as I saw her standing before the mirror, her back turned toward me. The reflection in the mirror showed her face, pale, eyes wide and empty like a lifeless doll. Her lips moved slightly, whispering something I couldn't understand. "What are you doing?" My voice was dry, barely above a whisper. She flinched, blinking as if awakening from a trance. "It's nothing," she murmured, then quietly slipped back into bed as if nothing had happened. I wanted to believe it was just stress, that maybe she was simply exhausted, but deep down, an unshakable dread took root in my mind. And then, the horrors began. The endless nights. In the nights that followed, I started hearing strange noises in our bedroom. At first, it was just soft murmurs from her, as if she were lost in a dream. But soon, those murmurs became something else. overlapping voices, distorted and fragmented, whispering through the darkness. One night, I jolted awake and saw her sitting upright in bed, staring at the corner of the room. I swallowed hard. Another bad dream? I tried to keep my voice calm. She didn't respond. Only the sound of the wind whistling through the window filled the silence, casting a cold glow on her pale face. I reached out to touch her, but suddenly, she tilted her head to the side in an unnaturally quick motion. A twisted smile stretched across her lips. "Can you hear it?" she whispered. A chill crept down my spine. "Hear what?" She didn't answer, only kept staring into the corner. A deep unease settled over me. Slowly, I turned my head to follow her gaze. There was nothing there, but I could feel it. Something unseen. Something watching us. The darkness takes her. In the days that followed, she became a shadow of herself. She wandered through the house like a ghost, her eyes hollow, her skin deathly pale. Sometimes I caught her standing before the mirror for hours, mumbling incoherent words. I was afraid. I was lost. She was no longer the woman I had fallen in love with. But I couldn't let her go. I had to do something to bring her back. And when I sought out the church, I finally had my answer. A ritual, our only chance to save her. A wedding at midnight, with chains to bind her and prayers to protect her. No matter what happened, I would not let her go. The darkness consumes her. I don't know exactly when things started going wrong. Maybe it was after we got engaged, or maybe it had always been there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for me to notice. At first, the changes were subtle, easy to dismiss. A sudden flinch when I touched her, moments where she stared blankly into space, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. But over time, the darkness seeped into every crack of our lives. And then one day I realized, she was no longer the woman I fell in love with. Whispers in the night. At night, I began hearing strange sounds coming from her. Soft murmurs, barely audible, broken and fragmented. At first, I thought she was talking in her sleep, maybe from stress or bad dreams. But then, I noticed something unsettling. Every night when I woke up, she was always sitting up in bed, head bowed, her long hair cascading over her face. Her shoulders trembled slightly with each uneven breath. I listened. Those sounds, they didn't sound like her voice. It was a language I didn't understand, words repeating over and over like a distorted prayer. I reached out and gently touched her shoulder. Her body jolted violently, as if being yanked from a deep dream. She turned to look at me, her eyes wide open, but empty, soulless. For a split second, it felt like I was staring at a lifeless corpse. "Are you okay?" I whispered. She didn't answer right away. After a moment, she blinked a few times, then gave a slow, quiet nod. But I didn't believe her. A chill crawled down my spine when I realized, even though she was awake, she was still whispering. The shadow in the mirror. As days passed, things only got worse. She wasn't herself anymore. Dark circles formed under her eyes, as if she hadn't slept in days. Her skin turned pale, almost translucent under the lights. But the thing that terrified me the most was the mirror. She would spend hours standing in front of it, silently staring at her reflection. One time, I stood behind her, trying to see what she was looking at. And then I saw it. The reflection in the mirror wasn't quite hers. The eyes were different, darker, emptier, an abyss of nothingness. And the mouth, it curled into a twisted, eerie smile, as if whispering something. I grabbed her hand, pulling her away from the mirror. But in that instant, I felt it. A numbing coldness spreading through my fingers, as if I wasn't holding her hand anymore. As if I was holding something else. Hidden horrors. There were times when I questioned my own sanity, But then, things became undeniable. I started hearing strange noises in the house. Footsteps in the middle of the night, soft, eerie laughter echoing through the halls, even though we were the only ones there. One night, I woke up and found her missing from our bed. Panic surged through me as I rushed out of the bedroom, calling her name. No answer. My footsteps echoed in the silent hallway as I moved toward the living room. My heart pounded in my chest when I saw her standing in the darkness, facing the wall. She wasn't moving. I swallowed hard. "What are you doing?" No response. I stepped closer, one slow step at a time. When I reached out and touched her shoulder, her body was stiff, unmoving. Then suddenly she turned around. Her eyes were completely black. Her mouth opened, but the sound that came out wasn't hers. A whisper, low, guttural, coming from somewhere deep, from somewhere that didn't belong to this world. I stumbled back, trembling. She was no longer her. The final choice. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. Something had taken hold of her, something I couldn't understand. And if I didn't act soon, I would lose her forever. I sought out a priest. The old man studied me carefully, his eyes solemn, before he finally nodded. "We must perform a ritual." I clenched my fists, my breath unsteady. "We have to save her." He held my gaze for a long moment before speaking in a slow, measured tone. "But you must be ready. This is no ordinary exorcism." My stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" His eyes darkened. "We're not just casting it out. We must bind it." A wedding of darkness. The ritual would take place under the guise of a wedding. A sacred union between me and her, but not just to bind two people together. It would be a seal, a vow that could never be broken. And if the ritual failed, I would lose her forever. I tightened my grip. No matter what happened, I wouldn't let her go. Even if I had to face the devil itself, I would fight to the end. This wedding would be my final battle. The wedding ritual of darkness. The night swallowed the old church as I stepped inside, the cold breath of the wind seeping through shattered stained glass windows. No lights were lit, only the flickering glow of candles trembling in the corners. The scent of burning incense mixed with the damp musk of time, making the air thick and suffocating. In front of me, the priest stood waiting, his black robe draping over his thin frame. Behind him, the worn altar was cluttered with ritual artifacts. A frayed holy book, a tarnished crucifix, and a silver ring resting in the open pages. She was already there. Lying motionless on the altar, her eyes shut, her skin pale. So pale it nearly blended with the white wedding dress they had put on her. Black silk ribbons bound her wrists, and heavy chains kept her feet in place. She didn't move, but I knew. I could feel it. Something else was inside her. Something not of this world. Whispers from the darkness. The silence was deafening, but somewhere within the cracked walls, I heard them. Whispers. They did not come from her lips. They came from the air, from the shadows in the corners, from the places where light could never reach. "We begin," the priest murmured, his voice low, grave. I nodded, stepping closer to the altar. My hands clenched into fists, trying to steady the tremor within me. This was not an ordinary ceremony. This was not the wedding I had once dreamed of. This was a ritual, a battle to reclaim her, to sever the ties that bound her to the darkness. The priest began chanting, his voice cutting through the heavy air like a sharpened blade. I looked down at the woman I loved, my fingers trembling as they brushed against her cold cheek. So cold, and the moment I touched her, her eyes snapped open. I froze. Those eyes were not hers. The reign of darkness. Two abyssal voids stared back at me, a twisted smile curling on familiar lips, But I knew the one lying before me was no longer her. Do you really think you can take her back? The voice that spoke was not hers. It was deeper, heavier, devoid of warmth. I gritted my teeth, taking in a shaky breath. She belongs to me. I spoke each word like an unbreakable vow. Her lips curled further into something not human. No, the thing inside her whispered. She belongs to me. And then, the candles went out. A wave of cold rushed through the church, and I felt it. Something moving in the darkness. Not a person, not something with a clear form, but a presence. A living shadow slithering around us like a beast circling its prey. The priest's chanting grew louder, faster, a desperate counter to the unseen force surrounding us. But it began to thrash, her body convulsing against the restraints. Her nails scraped against the altar, leaving deep, jagged marks. "Stop it!" I shouted, my fear tightening around my throat like a noose. But the priest didn't stop. He continued. He fought. The darkness screamed. The church trembled. The final choice. I knew I had only one chance. I grabbed the crucifix from the altar, raising it before her. Her body seized up, her mouth opening as if to scream, but no sound came out. For the first time, those pitch-black eyes flickered with fear. I saw her, the woman I loved, trapped deep inside, reaching for me, begging to be freed. "I'm sorry," I whispered, and then I placed the silver ring into her hand. It was ice cold, but the moment it touched her skin, a blood-curdling scream tore through the air. Not hers, the thing inside her. The shadow writhed, clawing to escape her body, twisting and contorting into a grotesque form as it was dragged out. But it couldn't hold on. The priest spoke the final words of the ritual. A blinding light erupted, consuming everything. And then, silence. Her return. She lay motionless on the altar, her breath weak. I knelt beside her, my hands trembling as I lifted her into my arms. "Please," I choked out. Her eyes fluttered open, no longer black, no longer empty, only hers, the eyes I had fallen in love with. She was back. I pulled her close, tears slipping down my face. We had won, but I knew. That thing was still out there, somewhere in the dark, waiting for another chance. And I would never let it take her again. The wedding of darkness. Thick darkness enveloped the space as I stood before the altar. The air was freezing, and the lonely flames of the candles flickered against an unseen wind. A pure white wedding dress covered her body, yet amidst its pristine beauty, heavy iron chains bound her wrists and ankles, securing her to the cold stone altar. Her eyes remained shut. I could still sense her faint breath. But what about her soul? Was it still there? Or had the darkness already stolen it away? Beside me, the priest stood in a black robe, his face hidden beneath a hood. His deep, solemn voice filled the void as he recited holy verses. But as the words echoed through the gloomy space, I felt it, an unnatural chill creeping into my bones. The darkness was resisting. It did not want to let her go. Whispers in the dark. I leaned down, gazing closely at her face. Pale skin, dry lips, yet still as fragile and beautiful as the first day I met her. "I'm here," I whispered, gently placing my hand on her cheek. But the moment I touched her, her eyes snapped open. I froze. Those eyes, they were no longer hers. Two bottomless voids stared back at me, empty, devoid of any warmth or humanity. A twisted smile stretched across her lips, and then, from deep within her throat, a voice that was not her own spoke. "Do you really think you can take her back?" A shiver ran down my spine as I instinctively stepped back. That voice was not hers. It was distorted, inhuman, echoing from a place beyond this world. The priest clutched his crucifix tightly, his chanting growing stronger, but I could see it, her body thrashing against the restraints. The chains rattled violently, the clashing metal ringing through the air like eerie laughter. "Let go," the voice whispered. "She no longer belongs to this world." I clenched my fists, locking eyes with those abyssal depths. She was still in there. I knew it. And I would never give up. The wedding of darkness. The priest gave me a signal. I nodded. I bent down, grasping her cold, lifeless hand. People exchange rings at weddings. But tonight, I wasn't just giving her a ring. I was trying to take her back from the darkness. The moment the ring touched her skin, an ear-piercing scream erupted. Her body convulsed violently, her back arching, the chains pulled taut as if some unseen force was trying to rip her away. The air trembled, the candles extinguished at once, and shadows surged like a tidal wave, pouring out from her body. Something was screaming, something was furious, and I saw it. A writhing shadow, its shape distorted, its glowing red eyes burning like the fires of hell. It shrieked and thrashed, but it could no longer cling to her. The priest raised the crucifix high, his voice thundering with the final words of the ritual. A brilliant light erupted. The darkness screeched, twisted, and shattered into 1,000 fragments before vanishing into nothingness. She let out a soft breath, then went still. I dropped to my knees beside her, my trembling fingers brushing against her face. Her breathing was faint, but it was there. Her fingers twitched slightly, then slowly wrapped around mine. I looked down, and I saw her eyes. Her real eyes, the ones I'd fallen in love with, looking back at me. No more darkness, no more emptiness. Only her. She had returned. The aftermath. I pulled her into my arms, silent tears streaming down my face. We had won, but I knew. Somewhere, deep within the abyss, it was still waiting, and I would never let it take her again. Vows in the darkness. The darkness inside the church had not fully faded. The air remained thick, heavy with an oppressive weight. I knelt beside her, my trembling hand brushing against her pale face. Her eyes had just opened, but before she could react, she gasped for breath, her body still reeling from what had just transpired. I gripped her hand tightly. "You're safe now. I'm here." She didn't respond. She blinked a few times, then slowly reached out, pressing her fingers against my chest, almost as if she needed to make sure I was real. I bowed my head, pressing my forehead gently against hers. But at that exact moment, she convulsed. Her body went rigid. Her eyes widened in horror, pupils dilating, and then that voice returned. "You think it's over?" A chill ran down my spine. It couldn't be. I spun around, looking at the priest. His face was pale, sweat dripping down his forehead. "We're not done yet," he muttered, his voice strained with tension. The air in the church shifted. A sudden gust of wind rattled the old wooden doors. The extinguished candles flared back to life, their flames flickering with an eerie blue glow. And then, I heard it. Laughter. Not hers, but its. The final struggle. I looked down. Her lips were moving, but I knew it wasn't her speaking. "What a pity," the voice purred. "You did everything for her. But did you ever ask if she wanted to come back?" I felt my breath catch. "She wants to come back. I know she does." My voice wavered, but I held firm. Those black, empty eyes stared into me. And then she laughed, a twisted, unnatural sound scraping against my ears. "Is that so?" Suddenly she lunged. The chains clattered loudly as she thrashed, her body arching unnaturally like a puppet yanked by invisible strings. I saw the red marks forming on her skin, her fingers curling into claw-like grips. And then I saw it. The shadow, no longer a vague presence. This time, it fully emerged. It slithered out from behind her, a grotesque form with countless writhing arms, hollow eyes peering into my soul. "You cannot have her," it hissed. And then, I felt it, a freezing grip tightening around my throat. I was lifted off the ground, choking. The air was forced from my lungs, my vision darkening. I struggled, but it was useless. It was killing me, right in front of her. The final choice. Through my fading consciousness, I saw something. Her eyes. For a split second, they changed, no longer black and empty, but her real eyes, the girl I loved. She was fighting. She was still there. I forced out a whisper, my voice barely more than a breath. "You're still in there, aren't you?" Her hands clenched, her entire body trembling violently. The shadow screeched, trying to pull her back, but I saw her fingers twitch. Then, a scream tore through the air. Not from it, from her. She was fighting back. I reached out, my hand desperately searching for hers, and the moment we touched, a blinding light erupted. Its agonized shriek echoed through the church, shaking the very walls. I fell to the ground, coughing violently, but I never let go of her hand. The priest raised his voice in one final resounding prayer, and with every word, the shadow writhed, shrinking away. She trembled, tears spilling down her cheeks. I pulled her into my arms, holding her as if letting go would mean losing her forever. The darkness convulsed one last time. Then, like a storm dissipating into nothingness, it vanished. Silence fell. The ancient church was now filled only with the sound of our ragged breathing. The end of the ritual. She had returned. This time, I knew it for certain. I held her tightly, feeling the faint but steady rhythm of her heartbeat. The priest exhaled, placing a hand on my shoulder. "You brought her back." I said nothing. I only looked at her, the woman I loved more than anything. But deep down, I knew one truth. Even though we had won this battle, the darkness had never truly disappeared. It was still out there, waiting. And I swore, no matter what happened, I would never let it take her again. The curse remains outside the church. The relentless rain continued to pour. The wind howled through the shattered windows, sending icy chills seeping through my soaked clothes. It seemed like everything was over. She had returned, the ritual was complete, and the darkness had been banished. But a strange feeling lingered in the air. It hadn't disappeared completely. I could still feel it. The priest, his face haggard and his eyes sunken, stood in silence, staring at the lone candle flickering on the altar. Its flame wavered, unsteady, as if some unseen force was trying to snuff it out. And then, when I turned to her, I realized the darkness hadn't let go. Signs of the darkness. She sat there, motionless. Her body had stopped trembling, but her hands remained clenched tightly around the fabric of her dress, her knuckles white from the pressure. Her gaze was fixed on the empty space before her, unresponsive to anything around her. "Are you okay?" I asked softly. She blinked, slowly, then turned her head toward me. A long silence stretched between us. Then she spoke. "Did we really win?" I froze. Her voice was still hers, but something was wrong. It was hollow, distant, like an invisible barrier had formed between us, a fragile divide between reality and something I dared not name. I swallowed hard and reached for her hand. "It's gone. I'm sure of it." She glanced down at my hand. Then, ever so slowly, she withdrew her own, as if my touch repulsed her. A chill ran down my spine. Number I had brought her back. There was no way it was still inside her. Whispers in the dark, the priest stepped forward, his wary eyes locked on her. Do you feel anything strange?" She remained silent. Only the wind howled through the shattered windows. And then she smiled, a faint, emotionless smile. But right after that, I heard something else. A voice, not hers, but another voice. A whisper from deep within her throat. The priest staggered back, his face draining of color. My heartbeat pounded against my ribs as I stared at her. "What the hell?" Her fingers twitched. I flinched as dark veins began to creep beneath her skin, as though something was slithering just beneath the surface. And then she spoke. Not in any human language, but in a distorted, inhuman melody, an eerie song that echoed through the air like a hymn from the dead. I instinctively stepped back, but a cold hand gripped my wrist. Her hand. Her eyes darkened, pupils dilating. And when she spoke again, her voice was no longer her own. "It's still here. Did you really think you could take her back so easily?" I felt my blood freeze. Number it couldn't be. I had watched it dissolve. I had seen the light purge it. But the truth was staring me in the face. It had never truly left. It was still here, inside her, clinging to her soul, consuming her bit by bit. Her eyes, those eyes I knew so well, were now filled with something twisted, something dark. And then she whispered, "You can't save me." The fight isn't over. The priest trembled, his voice barely above a whisper. It was never fully exorcised. The curse still lingers. She suddenly lurched forward, and the chains binding her tightened on their own, as if unseen hands were pulling them taut. She threw her head back, a piercing scream tearing through the church. But it wasn't a scream of pain. It was something else entirely. The candlelight was snuffed out. The church doors slammed shut. The wind howled, lifting everything into a chaotic swirl. And I realized this battle had never truly ended. The curse was still here. The darkness was still laughing at us. And did I have the strength to save her one more time? The last night, the rain continued to fall. Heavy droplets pounded against the ruins of the church, echoing through the dark, hollow space. I knelt on the cold ground, staring at her, the girl I loved, sitting motionless within the ritual circle. Chains bound her frail wrists, but it wasn't the metal that held her in place. It was the darkness clinging to her soul. She no longer struggled, no longer screamed. Only silence remained. A deathly silence. The priest stood beside me, his face etched with tension. His lips moved in a hushed prayer, his voice trembling despite his attempt to stay composed. But no matter how calm he tried to appear, I could feel the fear in every breath he took. Because we both knew, this time, it wouldn't give up so easily. When the darkness awakens, suddenly, the air inside the church shifted. The wind stopped. The rain outside fell silent. Every sound was drained from the world. And in that exact moment, she opened her eyes. Pitch black, no whites, no life. My entire body froze. She stared at me, lips parting, and a voice echoed from her mouth. But it wasn't hers. It was its. "You still think you can save her?" My fists clenched as a cold chill crept down my spine. "I won't let you take her," I growled. She tilted her head, a twisted smile stretching across her pale face. "But she already belongs to me." And then, every candle in the church burst into flames, their glow morphing into an eerie blue. Shadows stretched across the walls, shifting and writhing like creatures crawling out of hell. The priest gasped, raising his cross. "Back!" But it laughed. A haunting, melodic laughter that echoed through the room like a song of death. And then No. It rose to its feet. The chains rattled and snapped, breaking apart as if they had never held any power. I instinctively stepped back, but a cold hand seized my wrist. "I want to see what you'll do." Then she squeezed. A freezing sensation shot up my arm, constricting my chest. My breath hitched as distorted images flooded my mind. Screams, shadows, an endless nightmare. "No!" I clenched my teeth, mustering every ounce of strength to push her away. But it was stronger. Darkness surrounded me, pulling me into its abyss. Flashes of her face flickered in my mind, bound, screaming, being swallowed by the void. She was still in there. She was still fighting. So I couldn't give up. A light in the darkness. I forced my focus toward her. "Can you hear me?" I shouted. The darkness roared, trying to consume me. But I didn't back down. "You promised me that we'd leave this place together. Do you remember?" The shadows wavered. Her lips trembled. A single tear rolled down her pale cheek. And then, so faintly, I heard her whisper, "I remember." The darkness shrieked. It knew it was losing. The priest gripped his cross tighter, chanting the final prayer. A burst of light erupted. A blinding radiance cut through the void, tearing apart the suffocating darkness. She screamed, not in pain, but in defiance. The darkness thrashed, desperately clinging to her, but I lunged forward, grasping her hands. "You don't belong to it," I said, more certain than ever. And in that moment, everything exploded. Light flooded the space, purging every last trace of the shadows. A piercing wail echoed before fading into nothingness. I opened my eyes. She collapsed into my arms, her breath shallow but steady. It was gone. This time, truly gone. Dawn after the nightmare, I sat beside her, my hands trembling as I gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. The priest slumped onto the floor, his aged features marked with exhaustion. Outside, the first light of dawn broke through the horizon. I looked down at her. For the first time in what felt like forever, her eyes were clear. No darkness, no fear, only her, the girl I loved. She gazed at me, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm back." I smiled, squeezing her hand. I know. We had won. No matter how terrifying the darkness was, no matter how desperately it tried to claim her, my love was stronger,